You were the one! You signed those papers! Don't deny it.
The day they read her will, a man wearing an expensive designer suit stood up and screamed the word fraud across a marble conference table and pointed straight at me. 6 months earlier, I had never even heard the name Eleanor Whitmore. I was just a broke widow with 2 little boys, folding towels for $8 an hour, trying to survive. But an 85-year-old stranger nobody else wanted to sit with was about to hand my sons a future I never could have given them myself, and by the end of this story, you'll understand exactly why she chose us, and why her own family never saw it coming. If you enjoy emotional family stories with unexpected twists, subscribe and join us for more. I never imagined that walking through the doors of a nursing home with nothing but a kind heart would change my life, and my 2 little boys' lives, forever. If you had told me, on the night my husband's truck slid off that icy overpass, that a stranger with more money than I could count would one day change everything I thought I knew about family, I would have laughed. Not because it was funny, because grief doesn't leave room for anything else. It doesn't leave room for hope, or plans, or the idea that a Saturday morning could ever mean something again. But it did, and this is how it happened. The funeral was on a Tuesday. I remember that because Tuesdays had always been our grocery day, David and I stood at his graveside thinking about how I still needed to buy milk. Grief does strange things like that. It doesn't announce itself with big, dramatic moments. It hides in the small ones, the extra place setting you forget to remove, the sound of his truck that isn't coming home, the way Liam stopped asking when Daddy would be back because somewhere in his 8-year-old heart he already understood. Noah was 5. He didn't understand at all, not really, and some mornings I envied him for that. The bills came fast, faster than I ever thought bills could come. David had worked construction, good honest work, but we didn't have savings built for a life without him. I took a second job at the diner on Route 9, on top of my shift folding towels at the laundromat, and some nights I didn't sleep so much as I closed my eyes and waited for the alarm. People were kind, for a while. Casseroles showed up on the porch. Then the casseroles stopped, because that's what happens. The world keeps moving even when yours has stopped completely. My sister lived 2 states away with 3 kids of her own. My mother had passed when I was 22. There was no safety net under me. There was just me, and Liam, and Noah, and a house that felt too big and too quiet all at once. I don't know exactly when the idea came to me. I think it was a Saturday, one of the rare ones I had off from both jobs, and I was scrolling through my phone doing nothing, feeling the particular kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who love you but can't actually reach you. I thought about my grandmother, Ruth, who spent her last 3 years in a home outside Columbus. I thought about how she used to say the hardest part wasn't her body failing, it was the silence. Nobody visited. Nobody sat with her. She used to save up small stories all week, hoping someone would ask her to tell them, and mostly nobody did. I thought, maybe I have nothing to give financially, but I have Saturdays, and I have stories worth hearing if I just sit still enough to listen. So I called Meadowbrook Senior Living, the nursing home 15 minutes from our house, and I asked if they took volunteers. The woman on the phone sounded surprised, like it had been a while since anyone asked that question and meant it. "We'd love to have you," she said. "Saturday mornings, 10 to 1, if that works." It worked. It had to work. I needed somewhere to put all this grief that wasn't spilling onto my sons, wasn't soaking into every corner of our house. I needed somewhere I could be useful to someone, because right then, I didn't feel useful to anyone, not even myself. I told Liam and Noah I'd be volunteering on Saturdays, that I'd be helping some elderly folks who didn't have much company. Liam nodded seriously, the way he'd started nodding at everything since his father died, like he was trying to carry more weight than an 8-year-old should carry. Noah just asked if there would be cookies. "There might be," I told him, smiling for what felt like the first time in weeks. I had no idea, walking into Meadowbrook that first Saturday morning, that I was about to meet a woman who would change the course of my sons' entire lives. I had no idea her name was Eleanor Whitmore, or that she had a reputation inside those walls for being impossible. All I knew was that grief had made me small, and somewhere in that building, without knowing it yet, I was about to become someone's reason to keep living. Meadowbrook smelled like lemon disinfectant and old coffee, and the moment I stepped inside, A woman with kind eyes and a lanyard that read, Margaret Sloane, Director, met me at the front desk. You must be Emma, she said, shaking my hand warmly. We don't get many new volunteers who actually show up a second time, let alone commit to every Saturday. I told her I understood loneliness, that my grandmother had lived somewhere like this, and Margaret's face softened in a way that told me she'd heard 100 reasons people volunteered, and mine was one of the honest ones. She walked me through the common room, introducing me to residents playing cards. A man named Walter, who insisted on telling me about his years in the Navy. A woman named Dottie, who complimented my hair 3 times in 2 minutes. Everyone was warm. Everyone wanted to talk. It felt good, in a way nothing had felt good in months, to simply sit and listen to people who had lived long enough to have stories worth telling. Then Margaret's voice dropped as we passed a closed door near the end of the hall. That's Eleanor Whitmore's room, she said. I should warn you, she's particular. She's sent home every volunteer we've assigned her in the last 2 years. Nothing personal. She just doesn't like being handled like she's fragile. I asked what she meant by particular. She was a businesswoman, Margaret said. Built something enormous from nothing, decades ago. She doesn't suffer fools, and she especially doesn't suffer pity. If you go in there smiling like she's a poor old woman who needs cheering up, she'll have you out in under a minute. Something about the warning made me want to meet her more, not less. Maybe because I understood, in my own smaller way, what it felt like to have people look at you with pity instead of respect. Since David died, I'd gotten used to the tilted head, the soft voice people used when they talked to widows, like grief made you breakable. I knocked. A sharp voice answered. I didn't ring for anyone. I opened the door anyway, gently, and found a woman sitting perfectly upright in a chair by the window, dressed as if she were about to attend a board meeting, rather than spend a Saturday in a nursing home. Her silver hair was pinned with precision. Her eyes, when they landed on me, were sharp enough to cut glass. I'm Emma, I said. I'm a new volunteer. I just wanted to say hello. I don't need company, she said, not unkindly, just flatly, the way you'd state a fact about the weather. You can go bother someone who wants an audience. I nodded, unbothered, because honestly, after the year I'd had, nothing about a blunt old woman scared me. Okay, I said, but if you change your mind, I'll be in the common room until 1. I turned to leave, and just as I reached the door, she spoke again. What happened to you? She asked. I stopped. Excuse me. You've got the look, Eleanor said, studying me the way she probably once studied a balance sheet. The look of someone who lost something they can't get back. I recognize it. I wear it myself most days. I didn't answer her. I just said goodbye and left, but something about that exchange stayed with me the entire drive home. She hadn't smiled at me, hadn't invited me back, hadn't been anything close to friendly, and yet for the first time since David's funeral, someone had looked at me and actually seen something true. I didn't know it then, but Eleanor Whitmore had just noticed me the way she noticed very few people, and she was about to spend the next several months deciding whether I was worth trusting with the truth about who she really was. I came back the next Saturday, and the one after that, even though Eleanor never asked me to. Margaret told me later that every volunteer before me had given up after 1 or 2 attempts, discouraged by Eleanor's sharp tongue and colder silences. I understood why. She had a talent for finding the exact words that would make a person feel small, tossed out casually, like she barely noticed the effect they had. Back again, she said the second week, not looking up from her book. Don't you have somewhere better to be? Not particularly, I said, sitting in the chair across from her without being invited. My sons are with a sitter until noon, and the common room already has plenty of company today. So I'm your consolation prize. You're the only one who hasn't asked me to smile more, I said. It came out before I could stop it, but it was true. Everyone else at Meadowbrook, everyone at the diner, everyone in my life since David died, seemed determined to coax a smile out of me, like it would fix something. Eleanor didn't ask that of me. She didn't ask anything of me at all. She looked up then, just briefly, something unreadable crossing her face. People smile because they're uncomfortable with other people's pain, she said. It's not for you. It's for them. I didn't say anything to that, because it was too true to argue with. The third week, I brought a small bag of butterscotch candies, the kind my grandmother used to keep in her purse. I set them on the table beside Eleanor without a word and started reading the newspaper I'd brought along, not expecting conversation, just wanting to sit in her company. 10 minutes passed in silence before she reached over and took one. "I haven't had these in years," she said quietly, almost to herself. That was the first time I saw something soften in her, just for a moment, like a door cracking open an inch before shutting again. By the fourth week, our visits had become an unspoken routine. I'd arrive at 10:15, after checking in with Margaret and saying hello to Walter and Dottie in the common room. Eleanor would already be sitting by the window, dressed impeccably, waiting even though she'd never admit to waiting. We didn't talk about anything important. She told me about a garden she once had, decades ago, before her husband died and she buried herself in business instead of grief. I told her about the diner, about Liam's obsession with taking apart broken radios, about Noah's endless supply of knock-knock jokes. She never asked about my husband directly, but one Saturday, out of nowhere, she said, "It gets easier, not different, just easier to carry." I asked her how she knew. "Because I buried mine 41 years ago," she said, "and I still set 2 cups of tea some mornings before I remember." I felt something crack open in my chest, hearing that. Not because it was sad, though it was, but because for the first time since David died, someone hadn't tried to fix my grief or rush me past it. She'd simply told me the truth, that it doesn't go away. It just changes shape. I left Meadowbrook that Saturday feeling lighter than I had in months. Not because anything had been resolved, but because I'd been understood by the last person on earth I expected to understand me. I had no idea that Eleanor Whitmore, the woman everyone else at Meadowbrook avoided, was quietly becoming the first person since David's death who made me feel like myself again. And I had absolutely no idea how much more she was about to give me than she'd already given. By the 6th week, Eleanor had started keeping a small tin of tea bags on her nightstand, the same brand I'd mentioned liking once in passing. She never said she'd bought it for me. She simply had it ready every Saturday, along with 2 cups, as if it had always been there. "You don't have to make a fuss," she said the first time I noticed, before I'd said a word. "I simply enjoy tea more when it's shared." I let her have that. I understood by then that Eleanor showed care the way some people show love in a foreign language. Sideways, through actions instead of words, because the words themselves felt too exposed. Our conversations deepened slowly, the way trust does when it's built on a person's own terms instead of rushed. She told me about the company she'd built from a single leased storefront in the 1960s, how she'd been told by every banker in the city that a woman couldn't run a business, how she'd proven every one of them wrong over 3 decades. She told me about her husband, Charles, a quiet man who never once doubted her, who died of a heart attack at his desk while she was in a meeting 3 states away. "I wasn't there," she said, staring out the window instead of at me. "I've spent 41 years wondering if it would have mattered." "It wouldn't have changed anything," I told her gently. "You know that." "I know it here," she said, tapping her temple. "I've never known it here." She touched her chest instead, and for a moment, the sharpest woman I'd ever met looked achingly fragile. I didn't try to fix it. I just sat with her in the quiet, the way I wished someone had sat with me in the weeks after David died, instead of filling every silence with advice I hadn't asked for. That was the week Eleanor asked about my sons for the first time. "Tell me about the boys," she said, almost carelessly, like the question cost her nothing, though I could tell by the way she set down her teacup that it cost her plenty. I told her about Liam, serious and protective, how he'd started fixing small broken things around the house since his father died, like if he could just repair enough objects, he could somehow repair what had happened to our family. I told her about Noah, who still asked when Daddy was coming home some nights, not because he'd forgotten, but because 5-year-olds process loss in waves instead of a straight line. Eleanor listened without interrupting, which I'd come to understand was rare for her. "I never had children," she said finally. "Charles and I tried, for years. It simply wasn't meant to be for us." She paused. "I built a company instead. Told myself it filled the same space. It didn't, of course. Nothing fills that particular space. But I told myself it did, for a very long time, because the alternative was admitting I'd spent my whole life aching for something money couldn't buy me. I reached over and took her hand, something I hadn't done before, and she let me, her fingers thin and cool against mine. Would you like to meet them? I asked. My sons. I could bring them next Saturday, if you wanted. She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I worried I'd overstepped some invisible line we'd built between us. I would like that very much, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. I would like that more than you know. I left Meadowbrook that afternoon, with my chest full of something I hadn't felt in a year. Hope. Small and fragile, but real. I had no idea that bringing Liam and Noah into Eleanor's life the following Saturday would change something in her that had been closed off for 4 decades. I had no idea I was about to watch an 85-year-old woman fall in love with 2 little boys, the way grandmothers do, all at once and completely. I almost didn't bring them. Saturday morning arrived, and I stood in the kitchen, second-guessing myself, wondering if it was fair to bring my sons into a friendship I still didn't fully understand, with a woman whose sharp edges could just as easily turn on 2 little boys as they had turned on every volunteer before me. But Liam was already lacing up his shoes by the door, and Noah was asking, for the 3rd time, if the tea lady liked cookies, because he'd insisted on bringing a bag of chocolate chip ones we'd baked the night before. Eleanor was sitting in her usual chair when we walked in, dressed even more carefully than usual, and I realized with a small ache that she'd taken extra time getting ready for this. You must be Liam, she said, extending her hand formally, like she was greeting a business partner rather than an 8-year-old. Liam shook it seriously, and something about her respecting him enough to treat him like an adult seemed to settle something in his shoulders. And you must be Noah, she said, and before she'd even finished the sentence, Noah had climbed onto the chair beside her and opened the bag of cookies like they were already old friends. I made these, he announced. Mostly. Mom did the oven part. The oven part is the important part, Eleanor said gravely, taking a cookie with the same seriousness she might have signed a contract, and Noah beamed like he'd just been knighted. For the next hour, I watched something happen that I still can't fully explain. Noah told her 3 knock-knock jokes in a row, each one worse than the last, and Eleanor laughed, actually laughed, a real, surprised sound I'd never heard from her, at the 3rd one, which didn't even make sense. Liam noticed the old radio sitting silent on her shelf, dusty and clearly broken, and asked if he could look at it. Eleanor waved permission, and he spent the better part of an hour with his tongue between his teeth, quietly working at it with a small screwdriver he'd brought in his backpack, the same one he carried everywhere since his father died. By the time we had to leave, the radio crackled to life with an old jazz station, and Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. Charles used to play this station every Sunday morning, she said quietly. I haven't heard it in years. I thought it had died with the radio. It just needed a new part, Liam said, matter-of-factly, though his ears had gone pink at her reaction. It wasn't that hard. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, and I saw something pass over her face I hadn't seen before. Something like recognition, like she was seeing not just a boy who'd fixed a radio, but a boy who understood, in his own quiet way, that some things could still be repaired even after they seemed broken beyond saving. Thank you, she said softly. You have no idea what you've given me. As we were leaving, Eleanor caught my hand at the door. Bring them again, she said, and for the first time since I'd met her, there was no sharpness in her voice at all, just something raw and grateful. Please bring them every week. I promised her I would, and I meant it completely. Driving home, Noah asked if we could visit Miss Eleanor every single Saturday, and Liam, usually so quiet, said he wanted to bring his tools next time, in case anything else needed fixing. I smiled at both of them in the rearview mirror, my heart fuller than it had been in over a year. I had no idea, that afternoon, that Eleanor Whitmore had just started calling me something in her private thoughts that she would soon start saying out loud, something that would eventually change every single thing about how her fortune and her family would be decided. The weeks that followed felt like watching a garden come back to life after a hard winter. Eleanor began waiting by her window before 10, Margaret told me, watching for our car in the parking lot like a woman half her age. She started calling me my girl, sometime around the 8th week, the phrase slipping out so naturally that neither of us commented on it, though I noticed the way her eyes softened every time she said it, like the words meant something she wasn't ready to explain yet. My girl's here, she'd announced to Walter and Dottie in the common room, with something close to pride in her voice, and I'd feel a warmth spread through my chest that I hadn't expected to feel again after David died. Liam brought his toolbox every Saturday after that first visit, and Eleanor started saving up small broken things throughout the week: a stuck drawer, a flickering lamp, an old music box that hadn't played in years, just so he'd have something to work on. I understood, watching them together, that it wasn't really about the objects. It was about giving my serious, grieving 8-year-old a sense of purpose, a way to feel useful in a world that had taken his father without warning or explanation. "You have good hands," Eleanor told him one Saturday, watching him rewire the music box with careful concentration. Charles had hands like that. He could fix anything except the one thing that mattered. Liam looked up at her. What was that? His own heart, Eleanor said quietly, and though Liam was only 8, I watched something click into place behind his eyes, some early understanding that not everything broken could be fixed, no matter how good your hands were. Noah, meanwhile, had appointed himself Eleanor's personal comedian, arriving each week with new jokes he'd clearly practiced, along with elaborate stories about his kindergarten class that Eleanor listened to as though he were delivering a quarterly earnings report. She kept a small notebook by her bed, I noticed once, and when I glanced at it, I saw she'd written down some of Noah's better jokes, like she wanted to remember them, like she was collecting pieces of him. One Saturday, Noah fell asleep on the small couch in her room, exhausted from a full week of kindergarten and no nap, and Eleanor sat beside him for nearly 20 minutes without moving, watching him breathe with an expression I'd never seen on her face before, something between wonder and grief, like she was mourning every year she hadn't had a child of her own to watch sleep like that. "I used to think," she said quietly, not looking away from Noah, "that building something enormous would fill this particular emptiness. It never did. Not once. In 50 years. And now a 5-year-old falls asleep on my couch, and for 20 minutes I understand what I missed." I didn't know what to say to that, so I simply sat beside her, and we watched my son sleep together in silence. By the 10th week, Eleanor had memorized both boys' school schedules, asked after Liam's grades with real interest, remembered which stuffed animal Noah refused to sleep without. She'd become, without either of us naming it, something like family. I found myself looking forward to Saturdays the way I used to look forward to date nights with David, and the guilt of that comparison hit me hard some weeks, before I reminded myself that love doesn't subtract from other love. It only multiplies. I had no idea, watching Eleanor Whitmore fall completely and quietly in love with my 2 sons, that somewhere else in the city, her nephew Victor had just heard about our visits for the first time, and that he was already deciding we were a problem that needed to be handled. I met Victor Whitmore for the first time on a Tuesday, though not by choice. Margaret called me at the diner during my shift, her voice tight in a way I'd never heard before. "Eleanor's nephew is here," she said. "He's asking questions about you. I thought you should know before Saturday." I felt my stomach drop, though I couldn't have said exactly why. Eleanor had mentioned Victor only a handful of times, always with a tightness around her mouth, always changing the subject quickly afterward. "My late brother's son," she'd said once. "He visits when he needs something and disappears the rest of the year." I arrived that Saturday to find a man in an expensive suit standing outside Eleanor's door, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in the clipped tone of someone used to being obeyed. He ended the call when he saw me and looked me over with an expression I recognized instantly, because I'd seen it before, in the early months after David died, from people who assumed a young widow with no money must be angling for something. "You're the volunteer," he said. It wasn't a question. "Emma Brooks," I said, extending my hand. He didn't take it. "My aunt mentions you constantly," Victor said, his voice smooth in a way that made my skin prickle. "Along with your sons. Constantly. It's quite the friendship you've built, considering you're a paid nursing home volunteer, and she's worth considerably more than you could imagine." "I'm not paid," I said quietly. "I volunteer because my grandmother spent her last years lonely in a place like this, and I didn't want anyone else to feel that way if I could help it." "How touching," he said, and the words landed like an accusation rather than a compliment. "I'm sure it's entirely coincidental that the woman showing my aunt so much attention happens to be a widow struggling financially with 2 young boys to raise." I felt heat rise in my chest, the particular anger of being accused of something I hadn't done, something I would never do. "I don't know anything about Eleanor's finances," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I've never once asked her for anything. I come here because she matters to me. That's all." Victor smiled, thin and unconvinced. "We'll see," he said, and walked past me toward the parking lot without another word. When I finally sat down with Eleanor, shaken but trying not to show it, she took one look at my face and knew immediately. "He's been here," she said flatly. I nodded and told her what he'd said, watching her expression harden into something I hadn't seen since our very first meeting, when she'd been nothing but sharp edges and closed doors. "Victor has visited me perhaps 6 times in the last 5 years," Eleanor said, her voice tight with a fury I could feel rather than hear. "Every visit coincided with a business decision he wanted influence over. He remembers I exist precisely when he thinks about my money, and not one moment sooner. I've told him as much, more than once. 'I don't want to cause problems between you and your family,' I said, meaning every word, 'if my visits are making things difficult.' 'You are not the problem,' Eleanor said, gripping my hand with surprising strength for a woman her age. 'You have never once asked me for a single thing in all these months, Emma. Not money, not favors, not access to anything I own. You have given me your time, your sons, and more genuine company than my own blood has offered me in a decade. Victor is welcome to his suspicions. I know the truth, and so do you.' I wanted to believe her completely, but as I drove home that evening, I couldn't shake the unsettled feeling that Victor Whitmore had just decided I was an obstacle, standing between him and something he believed belonged to him. I had no idea how far he was already willing to go to remove that obstacle, or how much worse things were about to get before Eleanor would find a way to make everything right. Victor came back 3 weeks later, and this time, he didn't wait for me outside. I walked into Eleanor's room to find him already seated across from her, mid-conversation, his voice low and urgent in the way people speak when they think they're being reasonable, but are actually being cruel. "Taking advantage of a lonely old woman," he was saying, "and everyone at this facility can see it plainly, except you, Aunt Eleanor. She's here every single week with her children, playing house with your money and your attention, and you're too isolated to see what's happening." "That is quite enough," Eleanor said sharply, but Victor didn't stop, turning instead toward me as I stood frozen in the doorway. "How much has she given you?" he asked me directly, his eyes cold. "Cash? Gifts? Has she added you to any accounts yet?" "Because I've done some research, Miss Brooks, and I know exactly how deep your financial troubles run. 2 jobs, mounting debt, a dead husband who left you nothing. You found a very convenient replacement in my aunt, didn't you?" The words hit me like a slap, each one landing somewhere tender and raw, somewhere I hadn't fully healed since David died. I felt tears spring to my eyes before I could stop them, not from guilt, but from the particular pain of being accused of exploiting the one relationship that had brought light back into my life. "I have never asked Eleanor for anything," I said, my voice shaking. "Not once. I come here because I care about her. That's all this has ever been." "That's precisely what someone manipulating a vulnerable woman would say," Victor replied, and something in his calm, rehearsed tone told me he'd prepared this conversation in advance, that he'd been building this case against me for weeks. "Get out," Eleanor said, her voice rising for the first time since I'd known her, cutting through the room like a blade. "Get out of my room, Victor, before I have Margaret escort you out personally." Victor stood, straightening his jacket with maddening calm. "I'm only trying to protect you, Aunt Eleanor. Someone has to, since you clearly won't protect yourself." He left without looking at me again, and the moment the door closed, I felt the tears I'd been holding back finally spill over. "I should go," I said, my voice breaking. "Maybe he's right, Eleanor. Maybe this looks exactly the way he's describing it. Maybe I should stop coming, for your sake, so nobody can say—" "Absolutely not," Eleanor said, gripping my hand with both of hers now, her own eyes wet in a way I'd never seen before. "Emma, look at me. You have given me more joy in these past months than I have felt in 40 years. You owe Victor nothing. You owe me nothing either, though you've given me everything regardless." "He made it sound so ugly," I whispered. "Like every Saturday, every visit, was some kind of calculation." "Victor sees the entire world as a calculation," Eleanor said, "because that is the only language he has ever bothered learning. He cannot fathom that someone might simply show up out of love, because he has never once done it himself." I left Meadowbrook that day with my chest aching, Victor's accusations echoing in my mind the entire drive home. I told myself Eleanor's certainty should have been enough to comfort me, and mostly it was. But some small, frightened part of me couldn't stop wondering what would happen the next time Victor decided to fight harder, and whether Eleanor's faith in me would be enough to protect either of us from what was coming. I almost didn't go back the following Saturday. I sat in my car in the parking lot for nearly 10 minutes, Victor's words replaying in my head, wondering if my presence was truly a comfort to Eleanor or simply a complication I was too selfish to remove from her life. But then I thought about Noah's jokes, carefully collected in her bedside notebook, and Liam's radio, still playing that old jazz station every Sunday morning, and I made myself walk through those doors. Eleanor was waiting, as always, though something in her posture told me she'd been worried I wouldn't come. "You almost didn't come," she said, reading me the way she always could. "I almost didn't," I admitted. "Victor called me twice this week," she said, her voice tight. "Once to apologize for his tone, and once to remind me that a woman my age should be careful about who she trusts with her assets. I told him the same thing both times." "What did you tell him?" "That he only remembers I'm alive when he thinks about my money," Eleanor said, "and that until he calls simply to ask how I'm feeling, without an agenda attached, he needn't call at all." I felt something loosen in my chest at her words, some fear I'd been carrying since his accusations finally easing its grip. "I don't want to be the reason there's more conflict in your family," I said quietly. "You are not the reason," Eleanor said firmly. "Victor's greed existed decades before you walked through my door, Emma. You have simply given him a convenient target, because it is easier for him to accuse you than to examine his own absence from my life all these years." That Saturday, for the first time, Eleanor began telling me about her life in a way she hadn't before, not the polished version she'd shared in pieces over the months, but the raw truth underneath it. She told me about the years she'd spent building her company from nothing, sleeping 4 hours a night, proving herself to men who dismissed her on sight. She told me how she'd wanted children so desperately that she'd wept alone in her office more nights than she could count, watching other women balance families and careers, while she balanced only spreadsheets and loneliness. "I told myself the company was my legacy," she said, "that it would matter, in the end, that I built something enormous from nothing. But legacies are strange things, Emma. They don't keep you warm at night. They don't fix a broken radio, or tell terrible knock-knock jokes. I spent 50 years believing money was the answer to loneliness, and it took an exhausted young widow and her 2 sons to show me how wrong I'd been." I reached for her hand, and she let me hold it for a long moment in silence. "You've given me something Victor will never understand," she said finally. "You've given me a family, Emma. Not because I asked for one, and certainly not because I paid for one, simply because you kept showing up, week after week, expecting nothing in return." I left Meadowbrook that day with a strange, unsettled feeling underneath the warmth of her words. A sense that Eleanor was telling me these things for a reason beyond simple friendship, that something was shifting beneath the surface of our relationship that I didn't yet understand. I had no idea how right that feeling was, or how soon I would learn exactly what Eleanor Whitmore had already begun quietly planning. Autumn arrived, and with it came a different kind of Saturday, one where Eleanor and I sat wrapped in blankets by her window, watching the leaves turn while she told me stories I sensed she'd never told anyone else, not even Charles. "I grew up with nothing," she said one afternoon, her eyes fixed somewhere in the distance. "My father drank, and my mother worked 3 jobs trying to keep us fed. I promised myself, at 12 years old, that I would never again feel as powerless as I felt watching her cry over unpaid bills at our kitchen table." I thought of my own kitchen table, of the bills I'd cried over more times than I'd admit to anyone, and understood, in that moment, why Eleanor had recognized something in me from our very first meeting. "I built the company because I refused to be powerless again," she continued. "I told myself that money was safety, that money was the only thing that couldn't be taken from you, the way everything else could. I was wrong about that too, in the end, though it took me decades to understand it." She told me about Charles then, how they'd met when she was 31 and already running her first successful storefront, how he'd been the only man who never once tried to take credit for her success, or diminish it. "He used to say I built an empire out of spite and turned it into something beautiful despite myself," she said, smiling for the first time in the conversation. He was the only person who ever made me laugh at how hard I worked. What happened after he died? I asked gently. I worked harder, she said simply. It was easier than grieving. I told myself the company needed me, that there wasn't time to fall apart, and I believed that lie for almost 20 years before I finally slowed down enough to notice how empty everything had become. She told me about the years that followed, the acquisitions, the board seats, the eventual sale of her company for a sum so large I couldn't fully picture it, and the strange hollow feeling that came afterward, when she realized she'd spent her entire life building something with no one left to share it with. Victor's father, my brother, died believing I owed him something for simply being family, she said. Victor inherited that belief along with everything else. He has spent his entire adult life waiting for me to die so he can finally claim what he believes is rightfully his, though he has done nothing to earn it beyond sharing my blood. Do you have other family? I asked. None that matter, she said. None that have ever shown up for a single Saturday without an agenda attached. Until you. I didn't press her further that afternoon, sensing she'd shared as much as she was ready to share, but something had shifted permanently between us. I understood what he believes is rightfully his, though he has done nothing to earn it beyond sharing my blood. Do you have other family? I asked. None that matter, she said. None that have ever shown up for a single Saturday without an agenda attached. Until you. I didn't press her further that afternoon, sensing she'd shared as much as she was ready to share, but something had shifted permanently between us. I understood now why she'd built walls so high that every volunteer before me had given up trying to climb them. She'd spent a lifetime being wanted for what she had rather than who she was, and somewhere along the way, she'd stopped believing anyone could want her simply, without calculation. I had never once asked Eleanor about her money, not directly, not indirectly, and I realized as I drove home that afternoon that this had likely been the entire point of every test she'd unknowingly put me through. I had no idea, that quiet autumn day, that Eleanor had already begun making decisions about her future that would eventually upend everything Victor believed he was entitled to. The leaves had fully turned by the time I noticed something different in the way Eleanor watched me. It wasn't suspicion exactly, nor was it simple affection, though there was plenty of that too. It was something closer to study, like she was memorizing details about me she wanted to keep, the same way she'd started memorizing Noah's jokes, and Liam's careful concentration while fixing things. Tell me about David, she said one Saturday, out of nowhere, setting down her teacup with deliberate care. I hadn't spoken much about my husband to her before, not in detail, and I felt my throat tighten at the invitation. He was steady, I said finally. Not the kind of steady that's boring, the kind that makes you feel safe. He worked construction, came home covered in dust, and always kissed the top of my head before he even took his boots off. He used to say Liam had his hands, and Noah had his laugh, and I think about that every time either of them does something that reminds me of him. How did you meet him? At the diner where I still work, I said, smiling despite myself. He came in every morning for 2 months before he finally asked me out, and when I asked him why it took so long, he said he wanted to make sure I was worth the wait before he risked ruining a good breakfast spot with an awkward rejection. Eleanor laughed, a real laugh, and for a moment I saw a flash of the young woman she must have been decades ago, before grief and ambition had hardened her into someone the world learned to fear. He sounds like he loved you well, she said. He did, I said, my eyes filling despite the months that had passed. I still don't understand how to be a person without him some days. I just fake it, mostly, for the boys. That's not faking, Eleanor said gently. That's what love asks of us, in the end, to keep showing up for the people who need us, even when showing up costs us everything we have left. I asked her, then, why she'd never remarried after Charles, why she'd spent 4 decades alone with only a company to keep her company. Because Charles was not replaceable, she said simply, and because I convinced myself that being alone was safer than risking that particular kind of loss twice in one lifetime. I understand now that I traded loneliness for safety, and I'm not certain it was a fair trade. I told her I understood the fear completely, that some nights I lay awake terrified of loving anyone that deeply again, only to lose them the way I'd lost David. Don't let fear make that decision for you, Eleanor said, gripping my hand with unusual intensity. I let fear make every decision for me. For 41 years, Emma. I built an empire instead of a family, and I would trade every dollar of it for one more ordinary Sunday morning, with Charles, doing nothing at all. I never asked Eleanor about her money that afternoon, or any afternoon before it, though I sensed by then that the subject sat somewhere close to the surface of every conversation we had. I simply held her hand and let the silence between us say what neither of us needed words for. I had no idea that this particular conversation, more than any other, had quietly convinced Eleanor Whitmore of something she'd been circling for months, something that would soon set in motion events neither Victor nor I could have predicted. Christmas arrived at Meadowbrook, wrapped in tinsel, and the particular ache of a season that reminds everyone of who's missing from the table. I brought the boys every Saturday leading up to the holiday, and somewhere along the way, decorating Eleanor's room became our tradition. Noah insisted on hanging paper snowflakes he'd made at school, uneven and slightly torn, and Eleanor displayed them on her window as proudly as if they'd been commissioned from a gallery. Liam strung a small strand of lights along her bookshelf, testing each bulb with the same careful focus he brought to every broken radio and stuck drawer. "This is the first Christmas in 41 years I've decorated anything at all," Eleanor admitted quietly, watching Noah tape a lopsided star to her mirror. "I stopped bothering after Charles died. It felt pointless, decorating for an audience of one." "You're not an audience of one anymore," Noah said matter-of-factly, not looking up from his taping, and I watched Eleanor's eyes fill with tears. She made no effort to hide. We spent that final Saturday before Christmas, singing carols badly, Noah's off-key enthusiasm, somehow making the whole room feel warmer, while Walter wheeled in from down the hall to join us, and Dottie brought a plate of cookies she insisted on sharing. Margaret stood in the doorway at one point, watching the scene with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between joy and disbelief that Eleanor Whitmore's room had become the warmest place in the entire building. "I never imagined this room could sound like this," Eleanor said to me quietly, while the boys argued good-naturedly with Walter about the correct words to a carol none of them actually remembered fully. "I never imagined I would want it to." Later that evening, after the boys had exhausted themselves and fallen half asleep on the small couch, Eleanor asked me to stay a few extra minutes, her voice carrying a weight I hadn't heard from her before. "I need to tell you something, Emma," she said, though I'm not certain the words will come easily. I waited, watching her hands twist together in her lap, an uncharacteristic display of nerves from a woman who'd built an empire through sheer certainty. "You have given me something this year I did not know I was still capable of feeling," she said finally. "I had resigned myself, long ago, to living out my remaining years as a footnote in my own life, a woman remembered mostly for a company she built and sold, with no family left to carry forward anything that actually mattered. You and your sons have changed that, more than you understand." "Eleanor, you don't have to." "Let me finish," she said gently but firmly. "I am 85 years old, Emma. My health is not what it was, and I have begun making certain decisions about my future that I am not yet ready to discuss in full. I only wanted you to know, before the new year arrives, how deeply and completely you have changed the ending of my story." I didn't fully understand what she meant that night, though something in her tone left me unsettled, long after I'd tucked the boys into bed and sat alone in my quiet kitchen, turning her words over in my mind. I had no idea that Eleanor Whitmore had already begun the process of rewriting her will, or how much that decision would eventually cost all of us before it gave any of us peace. I noticed the decline before anyone told me about it directly. Eleanor's hands, once so steady pouring tea, had begun to tremble slightly by January. Her breath came shorter after even brief conversations, and some Saturdays, she seemed to tire before we'd even finished our first cup of tea together. Margaret confirmed what I feared during a quiet conversation in the hallway one afternoon. "Her heart," Margaret said gently. "It's been weakening for a while now. The doctors say months, possibly longer, but nothing is certain at her age." I sat with Eleanor that Saturday, holding her thin hand while she dozed intermittently, waking every so often to ask after the boys, to squeeze my fingers as if reassuring herself I was still there. "I've called Benjamin," she said, during one of her more alert moments, referring to the attorney I'd heard her mention only in passing before. "I've asked him to draft some changes to my will." My stomach tightened. "Eleanor, I don't want to talk about that." I don't want you thinking about. I need you to hear this, Emma, she said, her grip surprisingly firm despite her frailty. I have spent months deciding how I want my life's work to matter after I'm gone, and I need you to trust that whatever I decide, it comes from a place of complete clarity, not confusion or manipulation from anyone, including you, though I know you would never manipulate me. I simply need this decided before Victor finds a way to interfere. What are you deciding? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. That's not yet for you to know, she said, something almost playful returning to her voice despite her exhaustion. But I promise you this. Everything I decide with my whole mind intact, and Benjamin will make certain of that, in writing, with witnesses, precisely so that no one can later claim otherwise. Over the following weeks, I noticed Benjamin Harris visiting more frequently, always in a neatly pressed suit, always carrying a leather folder he guarded closely. He was polite to me, professional in a way that told me nothing about what was happening behind Eleanor's closed door during their meetings, though I never once asked him directly, uncertain I wanted to know. Victor visited twice during this period, each time louder and more insistent than the last, though Eleanor refused to let him upset her the way he once had. He senses something is happening, she told me after one particularly tense visit. He doesn't know what, precisely, but he can smell change the way sharks smell blood in water. Let him worry. It's the closest thing to consequences he's faced in decades. I found myself worrying instead about Eleanor's health, about the growing frailty I saw every Saturday, about how much time we might actually have left together. The boys noticed too, in their own ways. Liam bringing more elaborate projects to fix, as if keeping his hands busy could somehow keep Eleanor's heart steady, and Noah climbing onto her bed more often, needing less coaxing to simply lie beside her quietly instead of performing his usual jokes. I had no idea, watching Eleanor grow weaker that winter, exactly what she and Benjamin were finalizing behind closed doors, or how completely that decision would eventually reshape my family's future. I only knew that time, which had felt endless when grief first swallowed me whole, had suddenly become the most precious and terrifying thing I owned. Victor's investigation came to light on a Tuesday afternoon, though I didn't learn about it until Margaret called me at work, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "There's a man here," she said, "asking questions about you at the front desk. Says he's a private investigator, hired by Victor Whitmore. I told him he needed to leave, but I thought you should know before he tries contacting you directly." I felt sick standing behind the diner counter, my hands shaking as I hung up the phone, humiliation and fear tangling together in my chest. I imagined this stranger digging through my finances, my background, every difficult decision I'd made since David died, searching for something to twist into evidence against me. When I arrived at Meadowbrook that Saturday, Eleanor was already furious, her face flushed with an anger I hadn't seen from her since Victor's first accusations. "He hired someone to investigate you," she said, practically spitting the words. "As if you were some criminal to be exposed, rather than the finest person to walk into my life in 40 years. "What did they find?" I asked, my voice small, though I already knew the answer, because there was nothing to find. "Nothing," Eleanor said. "Because there was nothing to find, Emma." Benjamin received a copy of the report, since Victor foolishly used my own family's law firm for the investigation, apparently forgetting that loyalty in that firm belongs to me, not him. Every single person interviewed, your neighbors, your co-workers, even your late husband's family, said the same thing, that you are kind, honest, and have never once asked anyone for anything you didn't earn yourself. I felt tears spring to my eyes, relief and lingering hurt tangling together painfully. "I can't believe he went this far," I said, digging through my whole life, just to prove I'm exactly who I've always said I was. "Victor cannot fathom kindness without an ulterior motive," Eleanor said, her voice softening as she reached for my hand. "He has spent his entire life calculating advantage, so he assumes everyone else operates the same way. He will never understand that some people simply show up out of love, without a spreadsheet running in the background." Margaret told me later that the private investigator had spoken with Dottie in the common room, who apparently launched into a 10-minute defense of my character entirely unprompted, and with Walter, who'd reportedly threatened to call the police if the investigator didn't leave Meadowbrook property immediately. "You've built quite the army of defenders," Eleanor said, a small smile finally breaking through her lingering anger. Victor spent good money to discover what everyone here already knew for free. Despite Eleanor's reassurance, I felt shaken for days afterward, the violation of having my life picked apart by a stranger, settling somewhere deep and uncomfortable inside me. I thought about stopping my visits entirely, sparing myself and my sons from whatever else Victor might attempt. But then I thought about Eleanor, growing frailer each week, waiting by her window every Saturday morning for a car that belonged to the only family she had left that actually wanted to be there. I had no idea, sitting with Eleanor that evening, how much closer Victor's desperation would eventually bring him to the truth he feared most, or how completely his investigation had failed to uncover the one thing that actually mattered. February brought a change in Eleanor I couldn't ignore, no matter how much I wanted to. She tired more easily, slept longer between our visits, and some Saturdays her breathing grew labored simply from the effort of sitting upright in her chair. Yet despite her failing body, her mind remained sharp as ever, and she began spending her mornings, Margaret told me, working closely with Benjamin on something she refused to discuss with anyone except him. I arrived one Saturday to find a small camera set up in the corner of her room, along with recording equipment I didn't recognize. "What's all this?" I asked, though something in my chest already sensed the answer before she spoke it. "Insurance," Eleanor said simply, settling into her chair with Benjamin's help. "I've decided that whatever decisions I make about my estate, I want to explain them myself, in my own words, so that no one can later claim I wasn't of sound mind, or that someone influenced me unfairly." I felt my throat tighten. "Eleanor, please, I don't want to think about." "I need you to understand something, Emma," she interrupted gently but firmly. "I am not asking your permission, nor am I seeking your approval. I am simply informing you, because you deserve honesty from me, the same honesty you have given me every single Saturday for nearly a year now." Over the following weeks, I noticed the recording sessions happening regularly, always with Benjamin present, always behind a closed door I respected without question. Eleanor never told me what she said in those recordings, and I never asked, though the not knowing sat uneasily in my chest every time I saw the camera equipment. One Saturday, exhausted from a long recording session, Eleanor held my hand tighter than usual, her eyes searching mine with an intensity that felt like she was trying to memorize my face. "Do you know why I trust you completely, Emma?" she asked. I shook my head. "Because you have never once asked what I'm recording, or why," she said. "Victor would have demanded to know within the first 5 minutes. You have simply let me have my privacy, trusting that whatever I'm doing, I have good reason for it. That trust is precisely why I chose you, though you don't yet understand what that choosing actually means." Her words settled into my chest, like a stone I couldn't quite name, heavy with implication I wasn't ready to fully examine. I told myself she simply meant she trusted our friendship, nothing more, though some quieter part of me sensed there was more weight to her words than friendship alone could explain. That evening, driving home with the boys asleep in the back seat, I found myself thinking about the recordings, about Benjamin's frequent visits, about Eleanor's insistence on documenting her own clarity of mind so thoroughly. I thought about Victor's investigation, his accusations, his obvious hunger for whatever Eleanor intended to leave behind. I had no idea, that quiet February evening, that Eleanor Whitmore had already recorded nearly everything she needed to say, or that those very recordings would soon become the only thing standing between my family and Victor's determination to take from us the one true gift Eleanor intended to give. March arrived cold and gray, and with it came the Saturday I will remember for the rest of my life, though I didn't know it yet when I walked through Meadowbrook's doors that morning. Eleanor had grown noticeably weaker over the previous week, Margaret warned me quietly before I entered her room, her heart finally beginning the slow decline the doctors had predicted months earlier. I found her propped up in bed, rather than her usual chair by the window, her silver hair still carefully arranged despite everything, because even facing her own mortality, Eleanor's that morning. Eleanor had grown noticeably weaker over the previous week, Margaret warned me quietly before I entered her room, her heart finally beginning the slow decline the doctors had predicted months earlier. I found her propped up in bed, rather than her usual chair by the window, her silver hair still carefully arranged despite everything, because even facing her own mortality, Eleanor Whitmore refused to abandon her dignity. "My girl," she said softly when I entered, her voice weaker than I'd ever heard it, though her eyes still held that same sharp warmth I'd come to love over the past year. I sat beside her bed and took her hand, feeling how thin and cool it had become, how much frailer she seemed than even 2 weeks earlier. "Where are my boys today?" she asked. "With the sitter," I said. "I wanted to come alone, just to sit with you." She nodded, seeming almost relieved, and for a long while we simply sat together in comfortable silence, the kind we'd built over months of Saturdays, needing no words to fill the space between us. "I want to tell you something," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "and I need you to simply listen, without arguing or deflecting, the way you always do when someone tries to thank you properly." I nodded, my throat already tightening. "Before you walked into my life, I was simply waiting to die," she said. "I had built an empire, sold it for more money than any reasonable person could ever spend, and I had absolutely no one to share any of it with. I told myself that was simply my life's ending, a woman remembered for spreadsheets and acquisitions, with no family left who actually loved her, rather than merely tolerated her existence for the sake of inheritance." "Eleanor, let me finish," she said gently. "You changed that ending, Emma. You and your sons walked into my life expecting nothing from me, and in doing so, you gave me everything. You gave me Saturday mornings worth waking up for. You gave me a radio that plays Charles's favorite station again. You gave me terrible knock-knock jokes I now know by heart, and a young man with careful hands who reminds me, every week, that some things can still be repaired even after they seem broken beyond saving." Tears slipped down my face freely now, and I made no effort to stop them. "Thank you," she whispered, gripping my hand with surprising strength, "for letting me know what being a grandmother feels like, even for just this one precious year." I held her hand tightly, unable to speak past the lump in my throat, and we sat together as the afternoon light faded slowly outside her window, neither of us needing to say another word. I had no idea, sitting beside her that gray March afternoon, that this conversation would be among the last truly lucid moments Eleanor Whitmore and I would ever share together. Eleanor Whitmore passed away peacefully 3 days later, in her sleep, with Margaret and the night nurse by her side. I received the call at 5 in the morning, and I remember sitting on the edge of my bed in the dark, phone pressed to my ear, feeling a grief so complete it nearly matched what I'd felt the night David died. Liam heard me crying and came into my room quietly, wrapping his arms around me without a word, already understanding, at 9 years old, exactly what this particular silence meant. Noah cried too, when I told him gently that Miss Eleanor had gone to be with her husband Charles, though I watched him process it the way children do, in waves that came and went unpredictably over the following days. The funeral was small, exactly as Eleanor had requested in advance, held at a quiet chapel across town rather than anything elaborate that might have drawn attention or spectacle. I attended with the boys, sitting near the back, wanting to honor her without inserting myself into whatever family dynamics might play out among the handful of relatives who'd bothered to show up. Victor sat in the front row, dressed impeccably, his expression carefully composed into something resembling grief, though I couldn't shake the feeling that his mind was already elsewhere, already calculating what came next. Margaret found me afterward, squeezing my hand warmly. "She talked about you constantly, these last few months," she said. "More than I've ever seen her talk about anyone in all my years at Meadowbrook." I thanked her, my voice thick with tears I couldn't stop, and drove home that evening feeling the particular hollow exhaustion that comes after losing someone who mattered more than you'd fully realized until they were gone. Liam was quiet for days afterward, retreating to his room to work on small projects, though I noticed he'd started keeping Eleanor's old music box on his nightstand, winding it occasionally just to hear it play. Noah asked questions in fits and starts, whether Eleanor could hear us if we talked about her, whether she was watching Charles's old jazz station together with him now, wherever they were. I answered as honestly as I could, telling him I believed she was somewhere warm and peaceful, finally reunited with the husband she'd missed for over 4 decades. A week after the funeral, I received a call from Benjamin Harris's office, his assistant informing me politely that the reading of Eleanor Whitmore's will was scheduled for the following Thursday, and that my presence was specifically required. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long moment after the call ended, confusion and a strange, unnamed dread settling into my chest. I had never once discussed Eleanor's estate with her directly, had never asked about her finances or her plans, and I couldn't imagine why her attorney would need me present for something that surely concerned only her family. I had no idea, hanging up that phone, exactly what Eleanor had spent her final months quietly arranging, or how completely that Thursday reading would upend everything Victor Whitmore believed he was owed. The law offices of Harris and Associates occupied the top floor of a downtown building I'd never had reason to visit, all polished marble and hushed carpet that seemed to swallow every sound except the occasional cough or shifting chair. I sat in the waiting room that Thursday morning, dressed in the one good blazer I owned, feeling completely out of place among the leather furniture and expensive artwork lining the walls. Victor arrived shortly after me, along with two other relatives I vaguely recognized from the funeral, distant cousins who'd apparently traveled considerable distances the moment word of the estate reading reached them. Victor barely glanced my way as he passed, though I caught the flicker of confusion crossing his face when he registered my presence in the waiting room, clearly uncertain why I'd been summoned to something he assumed concerned only blood relatives. "Miss Brooks," Benjamin Harris greeted me warmly when he finally called us into the conference room, gesturing toward a chair near the head of the long table. I noticed Victor's eyes narrow slightly at the placement, though he said nothing, settling into his own seat with the confident posture of a man who'd spent his entire life assuming certain outcomes were guaranteed. "Thank you all for coming," Benjamin began, opening the leather folder I recognized from Eleanor's room. Eleanor Whitmore was extraordinarily thorough in preparing her final wishes, and I want to assure everyone present that every decision reflected in this document was made with complete clarity of mind, properly witnessed, and notarized well in advance of any decline in her health. Victor shifted in his seat, impatience flickering across his composed expression. Benjamin proceeded through several smaller bequests first: donations to Meadowbrook itself, a generous gift to Margaret personally for her years of exceptional care, modest sums left to distant cousins who nodded appreciatively, clearly satisfied with amounts that likely exceeded whatever they'd anticipated receiving from an aunt they'd barely visited. Then Benjamin paused, glancing briefly at me before continuing. "The remainder of Eleanor Whitmore's estate," he said, "including her primary residence, her investment portfolio, and the entirety of her liquid assets following the sale of Whitmore Enterprises, has been left in full to Emma Brooks." The room fell completely silent for one suspended moment before Victor's chair scraped violently against the floor as he stood. "That's impossible," he said, his voice rising with barely controlled fury. "That woman is a nursing home volunteer. She has no legal standing, no family connection, nothing beyond a few months of manufactured friendship with a vulnerable elderly woman. This is fraud." I sat frozen in my chair, the words barely registering, my mind unable to process what I'd just heard. I hadn't asked for this. I hadn't wanted this. I'd simply wanted Saturdays with a woman I'd grown to love completely, and now I was being told that woman had left me everything, while her actual nephew stood across the table accusing me of exactly the crime Victor had suspected me of committing from the very beginning. "Mr. Whitmore," Benjamin said calmly, entirely unruffled by the outburst, "I anticipated this reaction, which is precisely why your aunt asked me to prepare something specifically for this moment." He reached into the folder and withdrew a small tablet, setting it carefully on the table. "Eleanor recorded several video messages over the past 2 months," Benjamin continued, "specifically addressing the concerns she knew you would raise today. She asked that I play them for everyone present, without exception, before any further discussion of contesting this will takes place." Victor's face went pale as Benjamin pressed play, and I gripped the edges of my chair, uncertain whether I was ready to hear what Eleanor had left behind, or how completely those recordings were about to change everything Victor thought he understood about the woman he'd spent his whole life underestimating. Eleanor's face filled the small screen, thinner than I remembered from our final conversations, but her eyes held that same unmistakable sharpness that had first drawn me to her nearly a year earlier. "If you are watching this," she began, her voice steady despite her obvious frailty, "then I have passed, and Victor has undoubtedly already accused Emma Brooks of manipulation, fraud, or some combination of both. I know my nephew well enough to predict his reaction with near-perfect certainty, which is precisely why I am recording this message." Victor's jaw tightened as Eleanor's recorded voice continued. "Victor, you have visited me exactly 6 times in the past 5 years, she said, her tone measured but unmistakably firm. Each visit coincided precisely with a business decision you wished to influence, or a request for financial assistance you believed I owed you simply for sharing your father's blood. I have documentation of every single interaction, dates and requests included, should you wish to contest that account. The recording continued, Eleanor's steady voice filling the silent room. Emma Brooks, by contrast, has visited me every single Saturday for nearly a year, without ever once asking about my finances, my will, or my assets. She brought her 2 sons into my life, boys who have shown me more genuine affection in these past months than you have offered in the entirety of your adult life. She sat with me through every difficult conversation about Charles, about my regrets, about the family I never had the chance to build. She never once asked for anything in return. I felt tears sliding down my face, overwhelmed by hearing Eleanor's voice again, by the raw honesty in every word she'd chosen so carefully for this exact moment. I have instructed Benjamin to provide complete documentation of Ms. Brooks's financial history to anyone who wishes to review it, Eleanor continued. You will find no gifts, no transfers, no requests of any kind from her throughout our entire friendship. You will find instead a woman who continued working 2 jobs, raising 2 sons alone, and showing up faithfully every Saturday, regardless of what she had waiting for her at home. She paused, and something softened in her recorded expression, something that made my chest ache with fresh grief. I am leaving my estate to Emma Brooks, not out of manipulation or confusion, but out of complete clarity, Eleanor said. She showed me, in the final year of my life, what it means to be loved simply and completely, without agenda. Her sons gave me the experience of grandchildren I never had the chance to raise myself. I am not rewarding her for services rendered, Victor. I am simply choosing to leave what I built to someone who understands its true value is never measured in dollars. Supporting continued for several more minutes, Eleanor addressing specific concerns Benjamin had anticipated Victor might raise, each point dismantled with the same careful precision she'd once used to build an empire from nothing. By the time the recording ended, Victor sat completely silent, his earlier fury replaced by something closer to stunned humiliation. There is one final message, Benjamin said quietly, addressed specifically to Ms. Brooks. I looked up, startled, as he pressed play on a second recording, Eleanor's face appearing once more, softer this time, more personal, clearly intended for my eyes alone. Emma, Eleanor's recorded voice said, and hearing my name spoken so gently, made my breath catch painfully in my throat. If you are watching this, I need you to understand something clearly, before guilt or hesitation convinces you to refuse what I've left behind. I gripped the edge of the conference table, unable to look, appearing once more, softer this time, more personal, clearly intended for my eyes alone. Emma, Eleanor's recorded voice said, and hearing my name spoken so gently, made my breath catch painfully in my throat. If you are watching this, I need you to understand something clearly, before guilt or hesitation convinces you to refuse what I've left behind. I gripped the edge of the conference table, unable to look away from her face on the small screen. You will likely feel undeserving of this inheritance, she continued. You will tell yourself that friendship should never come with financial reward attached, that accepting this makes our relationship somehow transactional in retrospect. I need you to release that thought entirely, because nothing about what we shared was ever transactional, and nothing about this gift changes that truth. Her recorded eyes seemed to look directly into mine, and for one impossible moment, it felt as though she were truly speaking to me in that very room. I built an empire because I was terrified of powerlessness, she said. I spent 50 years believing money was the answer to every fear I carried, only to discover, in my final year of life, that the answer was never money at all. It was Saturday mornings with 2 little boys who loved me without knowing or caring what I was worth financially. It was you, Emma, choosing to show up week after week for a difficult old woman everyone else had given up on. I felt Victor's eyes on me from across the table, though I couldn't bring myself to look away from Eleanor's face. I want you to use this inheritance to give your sons the security you have worked so tirelessly to provide them, she continued. But I also want you to consider something beyond simply security. I want you to consider building something that honors what we found together, something that ensures no other lonely person in a place like Meadowbrook has to wait years for someone to simply sit with them, the way you sat with me. Her voice grew softer, more fragile, and I realized this must have been recorded closer to the end, when her strength had already begun failing. You gave me the ending I never thought I would have, she said. A family, grandchildren, in every way that matters beyond blood. I am not leaving you my fortune because I feel you are owed something, Emma. I am leaving it because you are the only person who ever loved me without wanting anything from me at all, and that kind of love deserves to be trusted completely, without hesitation or doubt. The recording ended, and the conference room fell into complete silence, broken only by my own quiet crying and the sound of Victor pushing back from the table entirely, his earlier confidence utterly dismantled by his aunt's careful, deliberate words. This changes nothing legally, Benjamin said quietly, addressing Victor directly. The will is airtight, properly witnessed, and now further supported by clear video evidence of Eleanor's sound mind and stated intentions. I would strongly advise against pursuing any contest, Mr. Whitmore, both for your own sake and out of respect for what your aunt clearly wanted. Victor left the room without another word, his footsteps echoing down the marble hallway, and I sat alone with Benjamin, overwhelmed by grief, gratitude, and a responsibility I hadn't asked for but suddenly understood I needed to honor completely. The months following the will reading passed in a blur of decisions I never imagined myself making. I didn't touch most of the inheritance right away, still adjusting to the strange reality of financial security after years of counting every dollar, terrified some mistake would reveal this had all been some elaborate misunderstanding. Benjamin patiently walked me through every account, every asset, every decision Eleanor had left carefully documented, and slowly, I began to trust that this was real. I paid off our debts first, quietly, without fanfare, finally sleeping through entire nights without calculating bills in my head. I moved the boys and myself into a modest but comfortable home, nothing extravagant, because Eleanor's example had taught me that enormous wealth meant nothing without the people who made it worth having. Then I began the project Eleanor had gently suggested in her final recorded message. I established the Eleanor Whitmore Foundation, using a significant portion of the inheritance to fund exactly what she'd described, a program ensuring no resident at Meadowbrook, or any partner facility, would ever again spend years waiting for someone to simply sit with them. I hired and trained companion volunteers properly, paid modest stipends to ensure consistency, and created scholarships for caregivers pursuing education in geriatric care, the kind of support that hadn't existed when my own grandmother spent her final years largely alone. Margaret cried when I told her about the foundation, gripping my hands the way Eleanor once had. She would be so proud of you, she said. She always said you had a gift for making lonely people feel seen. Now you're making sure that gift reaches everyone who needs it. We renovated Meadowbrook's common areas that following year, adding a proper garden Eleanor would have loved, comfortable spaces designed for families to gather, rather than simply visit clinically. I established a fund specifically for elderly residents with no surviving family, ensuring they would never face the particular loneliness Eleanor had described feeling before I walked through her door. Liam, now approaching his teenage years, developed a genuine passion for engineering, inspired by those Saturday afternoons spent fixing Eleanor's radio and music box. Noah, older now and thoughtful in ways that still surprised me, asked regularly about visiting Meadowbrook, wanting to spend time with residents there the way he once spent time with Eleanor, understanding intuitively what she'd taught him about the value of simply showing up. I thought about Eleanor every single day, not with the sharp grief of those first months after her passing, but with a warm gratitude that had settled permanently into my chest. I understood now what she'd meant about legacies not keeping you warm at night, about money never truly filling the particular emptiness that comes from lacking family. She had given me financial security, yes, but more importantly, she had given me proof that love could arrive unexpectedly, in the most unlikely circumstances, if you simply remained open enough to receive it. I had no idea, walking into Meadowbrook that first grieving Saturday morning years earlier, that I was about to build not just a friendship, but an entirely new chapter of my family's story, one that would eventually honor an 85-year-old woman's memory in ways neither of us could have imagined when she first asked me, sharply, what had happened to me. Years passed the way they do when life finally settles into something steady and good. Liam graduated college with an engineering degree. The same careful hands that once repaired Eleanor's broken radio, now designing systems far more complex, though he told me once that he still thought of her every time he fixed something others had given up on. Noah followed close behind, studying social work, drawn inevitably toward caring for people the world too often overlooked, exactly the way Eleanor had once been overlooked before I walked through her door. The Eleanor Whitmore Foundation grew steadily over those years, expanding beyond Meadowbrook to partner with facilities across the state, training hundreds of companion volunteers, funding scholarships for caregivers who might never have afforded proper training otherwise. I visited regularly, sitting with residents the way I once sat with Eleanor, listening to stories most people rushed past without hearing. On the Foundation's 10th anniversary, we held a small ceremony at Meadowbrook, unveiling a portrait of Eleanor that now hung in the newly renovated common room, painted from a photograph Margaret had kept from years earlier, capturing that rare, genuine smile Eleanor had reserved for the people she trusted completely. Liam and Noah stood beside me that afternoon, both grown now, both carrying pieces of Eleanor's influence forward in their own quiet ways. Margaret, still directing Meadowbrook after all these years, gave a short speech about legacy, about the difference between wealth and true richness, about a woman who'd spent 50 years building an empire only to discover, in her final year, that real value lived in Saturday mornings spent with people who loved you without wanting anything in return. I stood before Eleanor's portrait after the ceremony ended, the room emptying slowly around me, and allowed myself a private moment with the woman who had changed everything about my family's story. "You never had children," I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself, "but you built a family." I thought about that first Saturday, walking through Meadowbrook's doors, with nothing but grief and a desperate need to feel useful again. I thought about Eleanor's sharp voice, telling me she didn't need company, about the slow unraveling of walls neither of us expected to come down. I thought about butterscotch candies and old jazz radios, about knock-knock jokes collected carefully in a bedside notebook, about a woman who'd spent her final year teaching me that family isn't defined by blood, but by who chooses to stay. Family isn't always the people who share your history. Sometimes, family is simply the person who stays when everyone else walks away. I smiled at Eleanor's portrait one final time before turning to join my sons, carrying her memory forward the way she'd asked me to, one Saturday at a time, one lonely person, made to feel seen at a time, exactly the way she'd once been seen by a grieving young widow who never imagined that walking through a nursing home's doors would change absolutely everything. If this story touched your heart, let me know in the comments. What would you have done in her place? And if you believe kindness always finds its way back, please give this video a like. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another unforgettable story of family, betrayal, redemption, and hope. Thank you for spending your time with me today. Until our next story, take care of yourself. And remember, sometimes the people the world overlooks become the ones who change everything.